The air was sharp and cold on the night of April 18, 1775, yet it carried a tension warmer than fire. In the stillness of the Massachusetts countryside, a lone rider thundered down the road, his voice echoing against the darkness. "The British are coming," cried Paul Revere, his horse's hooves striking sparks on the stony path. Lamps flickered to life in windows, doors creaked open, and men stirred from uneasy sleep. Mothers clutched children close, and fathers reached for muskets that had not been fired in years. In every heart, there was a question: was this truly the moment the colonies had feared and hoped for? By morning, the answer would be written in gunpowder and blood. In the small town of Lexington, Samuel Whitman lay half asleep in his modest bed when the distant clatter of hooves reached his ears. At 20 years old, Samuel had known only the rhythm of farm work and the peace of quiet seasons. But when the pounding grew louder, joined by a voice carried on the wind, his heart began to race. He rushed to the door and saw neighbors running toward the green, some carrying muskets, others still fastening belts and coats. His younger brother, Thomas, barely 17, came stumbling after him, eyes wide. "Sam, what's happening?" he asked, his voice cracking. Samuel didn't answer. He simply turned to their mother, who stood in the doorway with worry shadowing her face. She placed a trembling hand on Samuel's cheek and whispered, "Be careful, my son. You're all I have left." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest like stone. By the break of dawn, 70 men stood on the Lexington Green. They were not trained soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, but each clutched his musket with steady determination. Across the frost-tipped grass, the sound of drums and boots rolled nearer. From the mist emerged a wall of red, British regulars, their polished muskets gleaming under the pale light. The two forces faced each other in an uneasy silence broken only by the soft clink of metal and the rustle of uniforms. Captain John Parker, Lexington's leader, stood before his men. His voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The words seemed to hang in the cold morning air, binding the men together. Then, without warning, a single shot cracked the silence. No one knew who fired it, perhaps a nervous hand, perhaps an accident, but its sound was like a spark to dry tinder. The British surged forward, muskets blazing. Smoke and screams filled the air. Samuel lifted his weapon, the recoil jarring his shoulder as he fired. Around him, neighbors fell, some clutching wounds, others still. Thomas stumbled beside him, his face pale with terror. Samuel shoved him toward cover, shouting over the chaos. The battle lasted only minutes, but when the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead, and the rest scattered. The green was stained with blood, the air heavy with the bitter scent of powder. The British pressed onward to Concord, their ranks unbroken. But news traveled faster than their march. From every village and farm, militia poured in, men who had dropped plows in their fields, apprentices who had left shops mid-task, fathers who kissed their families once and did not look back. Samuel regrouped with the swelling ranks near Concord, his hands still shaking from the morning's slaughter. There, on the slope overlooking the North Bridge, he saw hundreds of colonists standing shoulder to shoulder. The sight filled him with a strange mixture of grief and pride. They were not just defending a town, they were defending the very idea of freedom. When the British began destroying supplies stored in Concord, the militia advanced toward the bridge. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as they marched, the wooden planks groaning under their boots. Across the span, Redcoats formed their own line, muskets raised. The order was given, and the world seemed to explode again, gunfire cracking, smoke curling into the sky, men shouting and falling. Samuel fired, then reloaded with shaking hands, the motions becoming instinct. This time, the British line wavered, then broke. Cheers erupted as the Redcoats retreated, but Samuel felt no triumph, only the heavy knowledge that this was not the end, only the beginning. The retreat from Concord to Boston became a running battle. The British, harassed from all sides, fought every step of the way. From behind stone walls, trees, and fences, Colonial marksmen took aim, vanishing before return fire could reach them. Samuel moved with the shifting lines, his musket hot from use, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. He saw men he had known all his life fighting like they had never fought before, calm farmers transformed into fierce defenders. Every shot fired, every step taken was a declaration. They would not be ruled without their consent. But the cost was heavy. Along the road, Samuel saw friends wounded, some lying still in the grass. Once, he came upon a boy no older than Thomas, clutching his side as blood seeped through his shirt. Samuel dropped to his knees, trying to staunch the wound, but the boy's eyes had already dimmed. He stood again, his throat tight, and pressed on. There was no time to grieve, not yet. By late afternoon, the British staggered back into Boston, their retreat a shadow of their proud march that morning. The colonial militia had surrounded the city, beginning the siege that would last for months. For Samuel, the day felt endless, as if each hour had carved a piece from his heart. When the firing finally ceased, he found himself standing on a hill overlooking the darkening countryside. The sun dipped low, bathing the land in a deep red glow, as if the sky itself mourned the fallen. Samuel returned home under the cover of night. His mother met him at the door, tears brimming in her eyes when she saw him alive. But her gaze darted past him, searching. "Where's Thomas?" she asked, her voice trembling. Samuel's throat tightened. He explained how Thomas had been sent away from the Green, how he hadn't seen him since. Relief flooded her face when Thomas stumbled in minutes later, dirty and exhausted but unharmed. The three of them embraced, the weight of the day pressing down on them all. In the days that followed, news of Lexington and Concord spread across the colonies like wildfire. Men signed the names to enlistment papers, women sewed uniforms and gathered supplies, and the talk in every tavern turned to independence. Samuel could feel the shift in the air. This was no longer a protest over taxes or distant kings. This was a fight for something far greater. Yet the memory of that day stayed with him. The sound of the first shot, the chaos, the loss. He knew the road ahead would be long and bloody. The British were powerful, their army seasoned and disciplined. The colonists were untrained, their supplies scarce, and the risk of defeat loomed over every plan. But Samuel also knew something else. The people had tasted their own power. They had stood against the most formidable army in the world and had not broken. That belief, he realized, was a weapon no British musket could destroy. Months later, as the war raged on, Samuel would often think back to that April morning. He would see Captain Parker's face, hear the crack of the first shot, feel the weight of his musket in his hands. He would remember the faces of friends lost and the quiet bravery of those who remained. And each time, he would feel that same unshakable resolve take root again in his chest. The battles of Lexington and Concord were not just military skirmishes. They were the birth cry of a nation. They showed the world that ordinary people, when united by purpose and courage, could challenge the mightiest of empires. For Samuel, and for countless others, that day marked the moment when fear was replaced by determination, when the dream of freedom became a fight worth any cost. And though the war would stretch on for years, its end uncertain, the spirit born on that April day would carry them through every hardship. As Samuel stood once more on the Lexington Green years later, now older and hardened by war, he closed his eyes and listened to the wind rustling through the grass. He thought of those who had stood there with him, some never to return, and of the new nation they had helped forge. Freedom had not come cheaply. It never does, but its value was beyond measure. And in that quiet moment, Samuel knew that the legacy of that first stand would live on, not just in history books, but in the hearts of every generation to come.